Lincoln's community choice aggregation program and how some things about that, because that's focused on buying green electricity, and then move more into buying green electricity in general, how you do it, why you would want to do it, what the impacts are. And then at the end, maybe talk for a minute about where the state is headed in clean electricity. And then along the way, maybe we can touch on some of the questions that Ed asked or others. So just as a way of introduction for folks who might not be familiar, there are really three ways to buy electricity, whether clean or dirty, three ways to buy electricity in Massachusetts. So you can buy it through the utility or from the utility, really Eversource. They'll go out and buy it for you. And I'll actually should say as another preliminary matter, as Ed mentioned, electric service has two pieces in Massachusetts now. There's delivery, which is maintaining the poles and wires, sending your bills, stuff like that. Eversource does that no matter what. You have no choice about that. But the electricity itself, you have choices about. And there are three major choices in how you would buy it, either from Eversource, so they'll separately go out and buy it for you if you want, or you can sign a separate contract, a private contract with a competitive electricity supplier. And those are the folks who send you, letters in the mail all the time, call you on the phone. If you lived in a more urban environment than Lincoln, they would knock on your door and sell it door to door. So they're out marketing that all the time. And then the third way is that your town signs a contract with an electricity supplier through a community choice aggregation program. And that's what Lincoln has in Lincoln Green Energy Choice. So that's known as community choice aggregation, or CCA. So these are the three types. And now I have some numbers, I think, on the next slide, which shows you how that breaks down in Massachusetts. So the utility basic service, which is buying it through Eversource or National Grid, if you're a National Grid customer, is about 41% of the residential customers. The competitive suppliers are about, on the residential side, about 16%, which is much lower than imagined. When Ed was working on this back at the beginning, as I was, the vision was that by now that number would be 90% plus, but it's kind of stuck at around 15, 16%. But the thing that's really changed is the CCA programs like Lincoln Green Electricity Choice, which is now 42%, so almost half the state, and more now than utility basic service. So you can see that there. The other thing you can see from this slide is that looking at competitive supply, you see it's a fairly small percentage of residential customers, but a much bigger percentage of business customers. And if I had broken out the large business customers, you would see it's a very large percentage of those. So we have this competitive market. It works really well for very big customers. Hasn't had so much penetration with the smaller customers, but community choice aggregation, the town programs, is really taking over there. There are about 150 Massachusetts towns or cities and towns with programs like this, including Lincoln, of course, the start of the list, but the big cities, Boston, Worcester, Newton, Cambridge have it, and then an astonishing number right around you. So which I realized as I was putting this list together for the slide, I think almost all your neighboring communities have these programs, other than Concord, where I live, but Concord has a municipal light department, so we're not eligible. But pretty much everybody else, Lexington, Acton, Sudbury, Wayland, Weston, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these all have programs where they have in the case of Wayland and Weston, they have programs in development, but they haven't launched them yet. We look at Lincoln's program. A key feature is that it offers three choices around this issue of buying green electricity. So there's one option, which is the default option, which you get if you don't choose anything else. And that currently has 32% additional Massachusetts Class 1 RECs. Now, we'll talk more in a minute about what a REC is and why that's how you buy cleaner electricity. But for now, we'll just say it's 32% extra renewable electricity. Then most of the customers, about 80%, are in that option. Then there's an option to buy extra renewable electricity, which you can choose if you want, costs a little bit more. That has 100% renewable energy, and that has a little bit more than 10% of the customers in it. And then there's a third option, which is to have less renewable electricity, just 2% extra, and about a little less than 10% of the program is that. And if we look at the totals, it was about 73% of the electricity accounts in Lincoln are part of the program.
Paul, the middle option there with 100% RECs, that's really like 78% extra additional. Is that correct?
Yes, and yes, so it's what we do there, and we'll talk more about this as we go, but the program only buys what are called class 1 RECs, which are the highest quality ones. To get to, and some of those are required by the state, and then some we're adding voluntarily. So the way we do it to get to 100 is we take the 22% that the state requires, and then just as you say, we buy 78% extra to get to 100.
I'm just saying, looking at your slide, you had sort of apples and oranges. The middle one was 100%. The other ones are, say, additional. So
correct. Yes, you're correct. And that, yes,
yeah.
that is, that's the way it's always presented, and it's confusing. So it's not really a good way to present it. So you're right about that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to just have a couple of slides which showed how Lincoln's program compares to the rest of the state. So first, if we look at that additional class 1 percentage in that standard option, the one we was looking at a minute ago, Lincoln is near the top of the state in that. With your 32%, that puts you in what I guess 5th highest in the entire state for the amount of additional class 1 RECs there. Interesting to look at other communities. So Newton is and has always been the highest, and they're way up at 62% additional. And other communities, that are kind of like Lincoln, or similar to Lincoln in many ways, Acton, Arlington, are also very high. Brookline too, more affluent communities. But interestingly, a couple of communities that are much less affluent, Lowell and Worcester, are also very high in the ranking. So I find that extremely interesting, and they're much higher than communities that are, much more affluent, like, Lexington as an example, or even Bedford, or even a bunch way over on the right, that have very small additional percentages. Boston's at about, of course, they're the biggest one. They're at about 10. They're at 10% extra compared to, Lincoln's 32%, but Worcester's 30%. So that's one way to look at how Lincoln compares to the others. The other way is in what percentage of customers have signed up for the 100% product, or to Ed's point, the 78% extra product. And there, Lincoln's actually the highest in the state in terms of percentage of customers who've signed up for that. So this shows you at 10%, you're actually a little higher than that now, but in order to compare you to the other communities, I used the most recent data that was available for all the communities, which is from 2021. So you'll see Carlisle is also high there. Acton's doing pretty well. I know, getting to these numbers, 10% may not seem like a lot, but it's super hard to do. Some of these other communities that aren't even close to 10% have worked really hard to get to where they are. So Lincoln is really to be commended for it. And folks ask, because we work with a bunch of towns, they ask us all the time, well, how did Lincoln do so well? So I won't tell you what I tell them, but no, I mean, what I actually say is it's a close-knit community, and people talk to each other, and it's really the power of people in the community talking to other people in the community that has driven up your numbers. So I want to get now to the topic of how we buy clean electricity, and we do that by buying something called renewable energy certificates, which are RECs. And so what are those, and why do we do it that way? So a REC is a certificate that indicates how much electricity, not the nature of the electricity, the source of the electricity, not that what ended up at your house, but what was put into the electric grid on your behalf. And the reason it's done that way is that you can't, with a few exceptions, you can't really control what electricity shows up at your house. So an exception is like if you have solar panels on your roof and a wire that runs from the solar panels into your house, then you're using the electricity from the solar panels. So you can do that. But most electricity that we use comes from the electric grid, which is like a big reservoir. And there are electric generators, a whole bunch of them, and they put electricity into that reservoir. But then once it's in there, there's no controlling where it goes. Electrons flow where they want to flow, and you can't say, I want the electrons from that wind turbine, in Maine in my house. You just can't physically control that. It's not really any different from a water reservoir that might be fed by many streams. When you run the tap in your kitchen, there's no knowing which stream the water that's coming out of your faucet came from. And electricity works pretty much the same way. But unlike water, where, at least as far as I know, no one's trying to buy water from stream A rather than stream B, with electricity, people wanted to be able to buy electricity from the wind turbine and not from the coal plant. And similarly, regulators wanted to have rules about how much clean electricity suppliers had to buy. So they came up with this currency called a REC, which, as I said, indicates what was put into the grid on your behalf. And that's all very carefully tracked. So it's done in unit of megawatt hours. Every megawatt hour of electric generation that goes in gets a REC, and then those are traded, and the regulators are able to keep track of what electricity was associated with whom. So that's how that whole system, that's what the reason for that system, and that's in simple terms how it works. So when we talk about buying clean electricity, we're really buying the RECs. That's the way we would determine whether we're buying clean electricity or not. So I wanted to talk next about why you would want to buy clean electricity, or what's the impact of it. And as I think about it, there are really sort of two purposes: sort of allocating existing electricity and then creating more clean electricity. And I'll talk about that first one first. And the issue there is that in most circumstances, when you buy a REC, you're buying a REC from an existing generator. The RECs are traded annually. These are projects that are running anyway. There's this supply of RECs, and when you make a purchase, you're deciding what of that supply goes to you. And it's largely about, from this perspective, sort of about your values and what kind of electricity you want for yourself. And for this purpose of just allocating what's there, it's less important what type of REC it was. And there are a whole bunch of different types, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for this purpose of allocating, it doesn't matter so much. And the EPA certainly says it doesn't really matter at all. And they say you can buy RECs from Texas, and those count for this allocation purpose just as much as RECs from Massachusetts. So that's one thing you're doing. You're just deciding based on your own values, I want the cleaner stuff rather than the dirtier stuff, even though the cleaner stuff costs a little bit more. The other issue about buying RECs is trying to create more renewable energy. So not just allocating what counts for you this year, but trying to change the world, trying to have there be more renewable energy in the future. And so how are you doing that when you buy RECs from plants that existed anyway and were operating anyway? So the theory behind that is that by buying certain types of RECs, and we'll talk about the different kinds, you're creating a market demand, which would lead to the construction of more clean energy projects over time. in kind of a simple market principle, the way lots of things work. We all buy iPhones, and so, Apple's going to make more iPhones because people want to buy them. So a lot of people are buying clean electricity. The people who generate clean electricity will make more projects and make more clean electricity for people to buy. That's the argument, and it's particularly tied to where there's a state requirement for something. These additional purchases over and above the state requirement have an even greater impact because there's so much that's required to be produced. If we're buying up some of that supply for that, that's creating more of a demand to meet the state requirements. So the two things work together, the voluntary purchases and the requirements. So what I have here is a complicated table, and it's a lot of text for 7 o'clock at night. But what I wanted to do with it was to talk about two things. One is to give some examples of these different kinds of RECs and try to explain why programs like your town program buys these class 1 RECs. And then also talk about the difference between what the state says is the amount of renewable energy in the electricity you buy, and then how a program like the Lincoln program might count that. So what this does is it lists all the state renewable energy requirements, and all the electricity you buy has to have electricity from these sources in these amounts. And the confounding thing is that it's not a list of renewable and clean energy. It's really a list of renewable or clean energy sources. Some of the things are renewable, but not so clean, and other things aren't renewable, but are clean. So it's a bit of a confounding list, and that's why it can make it complicated to answer the question of what's in the electricity you buy or how clean it is. So I'll talk most about the first one, which is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS Class 1. And that's the list of the types of generators that qualify for that. That comes next. And it's mostly wind and solar. There are other things on the list, but the great majority of it turns out to be wind and solar. And it has to have been, the projects have to have been built on or after January 1st, 1998. Now, that's what in the industry we call new. Now, if it were a car built in 1998, no one would be calling it new. But in the renewable electricity world, after 1998 is new. And the important thing is, it's the requirement this year is 22%, but that goes up every single year. So there's this regulatory demand to create new projects because there's an increasing regulatory requirement. And those are the RECs, they're the most expensive ones, but those are the ones that programs like the Lincoln program buy. The next one down, and this shows the difference, is the Class 2 RECs. So it's the same technologies as in Class 1, but it's older projects built before January 1st of 1998, so really old. So when you buy those, you can have this allocation benefit. So you can say, I'm buying electricity from a wind turbine, but you're not creating a market demand that's going to lead to more of those, because it's not possible to build more projects that were built before 1998. So when you buy those, it's just about allocating. It's not about creating new. Whereas when you buy the Class 1s, because they're built after a certain date, so new ones count and it's increasing demand, there you're both allocating and you're creating a demand for things that are new. The next one down is Renewable Portfolio Standard Waste to Energy projects. So these are both old, before 1998, and they're also really dirty. They're one of the most polluting generators on the electric grid. But because they're included in the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the state counts them as being in this group of clean/renewable projects. But most programs, when they talk about what's in the electricity they sell, they don't want to highlight this because it doesn't, might be renewable, but it doesn't advance their goal, which is cleaner electricity, not just renewable. Then there are others. There's the Clean Energy Standard, which is other new stuff that doesn't quite count as class one. Mostly that's about large scale hydro, the new hydro from Quebec. And then the final one, Clean Energy Standard existing, is older stuff, but that does exist and doesn't produce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's hydro, big hydro, and nuclear, which counts here too. So those are all the things that the state counts towards clean energy, clean/renewable energy. And that's why the state says, you know, the electricity you're buying now is 59.2% clean/renewable. But when a program like the Lincoln program is buying extra renewables, you're really focusing on that first one, the class one, because it's clean, renewable, and buying some of that leads to a demand for more projects rather than only allocating from what already exists. So that was a lot. I can pause there for a second if folks want, or I have another slide about where we're headed from here, which is an interesting thing to look at.
Which of the numbers in the right-hand column add up to the 59.2?
Oh, so that's another confusing thing. So yes, thanks for pointing that out because I forgot to mention. So the way you get to 59.2 is that the Clean Energy Standard, the second one up from the bottom, includes the RPS. So you don't, includes RPS class one. So you don't count that first 22%, and then all the others should add up to 59.2.
I'd also make the point that January 1, 1998 was about the time that the electric industry in Massachusetts was restructured. And I can remember well the meeting where the waste to energy guys said, you know, walked in the door and said, well, darn it, we're renewable. We've got all this garbage coming in, you know, and you know, so sausage was made.
Yes.
Back in the day.
Yes, that's exactly right. And part of it was because they wanted it, because they said, if you know, all the cities and towns sent their garbage to them, and they said, well, we're going to increase our fees to the cities and towns if we don't get this counted as a renewable energy resource and get some revenue for that. So all the towns signed on to the sausage making to reduce municipal costs. So why don't I move, I just had one more here and just in the prepared slides, although I have other things I can pull up if people have questions. So what this table shows us is from the state's Clean Energy and Climate Plan, the amount of electricity, clean electricity generation, as they're counting it, we have today, and then what they're counting on by 2050 in order to meet the state's climate goals by 2050. And a few things are really interesting here, I think. So these numbers, I didn't put the units, they're in terawatt hours of electricity. So one thing that's interesting is that of all the in New England renewables resources today, solar is the biggest at 8 terawatt hours, bigger than onshore wind and bigger than hydro. And the great majority of that is in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has way more solar than the other New England states do. And I will say that our friend here, Ed Kern, has a whole lot to do with that, because it was Ed's work really as a pioneer in the early days of the solar industry, which is why Massachusetts is such a leader in solar now, and why we have all those big solar fields that you see on the highways and other places. So I think Ed gets all the credit for that 8 number in the first column. Well, that's one thing that's of interest. Another thing that's of interest, though, is how much the state is counting on that to grow in order to meet the clean energy goals. So that 8 they're planning to get to 125. So I think that's 15-fold increase in solar. And offshore wind which is easier to build big, scales up more easily, but still would go from 0 to 124 terawatt hours. So big, huge additional amounts of this clean energy. The other thing that's interesting here is that part of the reason the state needs these clean resources to increase so much is that there are two reasons. One is they're looking to be phasing out the more traditional generators, which now mostly are natural gas fired plants that generate electricity by burning natural gas. So in order to meet the climate goals, the states wants to move away from those. We've already moved away pretty much from the oil-fired ones and the coal-fired ones, but they're going to squeeze out the gas ones. So we need to replace those. But the other reason, which relates to, I think, other things that this group has been looking at, is that they're counting on a very big increase in electricity use because they're counting on a switch from natural gas heating to electricity and gasoline burning vehicles to electric vehicles. So not only do we need to build a whole bunch of more renewable generators to replace existing fossil fuel generators, we need to build a whole bunch more in order to supply a greatly increased demand for electricity as we move to more to electric heat and electric vehicles.
Paul, is the total number the total of all electricity, or I mean, what is there another line at the bottom, like total of all sources by year?
There would be. I didn't have those numbers easily to put together. There is a line for that, and it's interesting to see how that changes. I can look. I don't have it in this slide. I don't know if I have those numbers handy, but if I'd had a minute to make another slide, I would have made that.
But are you saying that 2050 would be not much more than 348?
Correct. It's just a handful.
Because by 2050 we'd almost be at 100%.
Correct.
Clean. So that's the total, and presumably that number is maybe twice what we're using right now total. So maybe we're at, I don't know, 175 or something like that.
Yes, conceptually, that's it. That's it exactly.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's like that. It's really a huge increase in electricity use.
That's one thing about this subject, is that there are way too many numbers. Anyway.
Right. Yes, exactly right. So this is a good subject for people who like numbers, but it can be off-putting for those who don't. So.
Mm-hmm.
So I see Jim has his hand up. I don't know who's managing the hands. I'm happy to do it, or is there an official moderator for this?
Oh gosh. Why don't we just, we're a friendly group. Jim, why don't you just go?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if we're getting to a question and answer session or what, but I do have a question that's burning. I'm burning to ask.
Go for.
The thing about RECs that always bothers me, or that I've never quite resolved in my mind, is it is both an incentive to build new projects, and it's a way to account for who can claim being green, right?
Exactly.
And there's a tension there. When I put panels on my roof, do I sell my RECs and lower my cost of installing it to take advantage of that incentive that has nicely been set up to encourage me to do this project? Or do I be extra green and put up my panels without even taking the financial incentive of the RECs and get to claim the green electrons for myself? In other words, Paul, do you think that you get to feel any credit for building the green electricity generation device separately from the RECs? Or do you think that you have to keep the RECs and retire them yourself if you want to claim that you're green?
So I would say, in answer to that question, that I think with RECs, as in many things in life, there's a difference between doing something and taking credit for doing something. And I personally think when you put the solar panels on your roof, you're doing something. And if you're buying the RECs, well, you're doing something else, but you're not doing something quite so tangible as putting solar panels on the roof. But that's is very much attention in this system. I think you're exactly right.
You know, the one thing though, Jim, is that you can sell the RECs and then buy the you know, the class 1 RECs. You can sell them and buy them, and you probably come out ahead
I think that
by
used to
doing
be
that
true.
financially.
And I think that used to be true. I think now that there's no, now that we're through with smart and we're through
Yeah.
with SRECs, I think the RECs that you can generate are the same ones that you're buying for 3 cents a kilowatt hour. So I don't think there's
Yeah.
any financial arbitrage available at this point. So I think you basically have to decide, are you going to claim those electrons, or are you going to be just happy that you put some solar panels out there?
I think that's, I'll just respond to that quickly. I think that's exactly correct. If the alternative you would buy would be class 1 RECs. If you wanted to buy something else like wind from Texas, it would be a lot less. And you would end up ahead financially on that. If you found the wind RECs from Texas to be acceptable for you.
Can I follow up on Paul, your answer to Jim? So you said that if you put solar on your roof, as I have done, you've done something, right? But the question is, have you done something to increase the percentage of green on the grid if you sell your RECs, as I still am? My impression is the answer is no.
Well, hang on a second, Paul. If all of us put solar panels on our roofs, we're good, right?
Well, there's different definitions of good. I'm framing it this way. Do we lead to increase in the percentage of solar on the grid? My understanding is we have not, if we sell the RECs, because that's that much fewer that Eversource had to buy and inspire someone else to build. Correct or not?
So I'm going to put it this way, Paul. My simple theory, and I'd be happy for somebody to debunk this, is that until we get to 50% of New England grid generation being class 1, you still get upward pressure to install new projects. Because basically we're talking about double counting. We're basically talking about the person who puts the panels up feels like they're being green, and the person who buys the RECs from them feels like they're being green. So you kind of are double counting that production, sort of. But you still have upward incentive to build more solar until you get to 50% class 1 in the state overall, right? Because double counting still doesn't get you to 100%.
Yeah. My question is independent from whether I'm double counting or not. My question I didn't hear, let's see if Paul will answer, is if I sell my RECs, doesn't mean there's that many fewer RECs that the utility is required to procure elsewhere.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. So I mean, in one way of counting, and that's part of part of the challenge is there are a few different ways that this gets counted, even by different regulators count it differently. So, but if in one way of counting, the REC-based counting of things, you're correct that if you build the panels but sell the RECs, two people aren't adding to the amount of renewable electricity on the grid because someone else is getting those RECs. So you're right from that perspective.
Right. But yeah, so not to put words in your mouth, but this is what I have me checking my own head. But if I build and don't sell the RECs, then I added to the grid, and the RPS still does its work, making other people build up more, create more REC capacity.
That's correct. And I also think that there are there are lots of ways to think about the causation here, and a purely rec-based way is one way to think about causation, but there are other ways to think about causation.
Yes.
Who put the money in to have the project get built? That's another way to think about causation. Or who physically went up on the roof and installed the panels? That's another way to think about causation. So I think personally, but this isn't based, I mean, this isn't necessarily the way anybody official thinks about it. I think, you know, these projects have many fathers or many mothers, and lots of people contribute towards it in different ways. And I don't think any one person gets all the credit. And I think all of these ways of contributing are positive and help towards meeting the goal.
I see Stephen Lowe has his hand up. You want to go off mute?
Steve. Unmute yourself, Steve.
I just did. So I've always been very confused by this program and find it very hard to articulate the thoughts that run through my mind and to put them into words that would be clear to anybody. But let me begin by telling you that one of the things I did last weekend was I sat down and I took a look at the last 12 months worth of electricity that I used, and the number of kilowatt hours. And I then computed the difference between what that electricity would have cost if I had simply stayed with Eversource versus what the electricity cost by going with the Lincoln Choice Plan. And one of the things that I discovered in going through that calculation was that the Lincoln Choice Plan actually gives me 2% more of my usage in the form of clean energy. Is that, I think that's correct, and I think that was stated earlier. Am I correct in saying that?
It depends on which you signed up for.
I signed up for the, I think I was, hopefully, I think I signed up for the 2% over plan, what you called the basic plan.
Okay.
So that meant that I was at 2% of my power would be coming, if I chose the Lincoln Choice Plan, which I had actually, I would be getting 2% more energy from renewable sources. And I then computed what the cost of that incremental energy was, and it turned out to be about 80 cents a kilowatt hour for the incremental increase. And so that, of course, is a very large number compared to what we're actually paying for electricity, even during the 6 months of the year that the rates were high, the winter months of the year. They're going to be a lot lower in the next 6 months after July 1. So the question I have, the first question I guess that I have is, when I pay that additional 80 cents per kilowatt hour for a couple of hundred, I think it was about a couple of hundred a kilowatt hours that I was actually getting, who gets that money? Where's it going?
80 cents, Steve,
Yeah,
80 cents per kilowatt hour sounds way high.
You know, I know it does, but I'd be happy to share. We can do this offline, but I'd be happy to
Okay.
share the analysis that I did, but that's what it came out to be.
Yeah,
I know it sounds very high. It sounds very high to me too, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure anybody has ever done this calculation to see what the incremental cost is. And
Well,
one
I
of the
think-
reasons why that, let me just say one reason, I don't have the spreadsheet in front of me, that's down on my computer downstairs. But one of the reasons that the number is so high is because the Lincoln Choice Plan is very high during the last 6 months of this year relative to what Eversource wants to charge us. And so when you do the calculation, it turns out that these incremental kilowatt hours that we're getting through the basic plan are extremely expensive, 80 cents a kilowatt hour.
Yeah, we
And the
believe that's
question
not true. If you look at
Okay.
the actual hourly rate, just look at hourly rate and it's not higher.
Steve, I'd be happy to take this offline. I think
Yeah.
we've got a number wrong someplace because
Okay, and I'd be happy to do that because this is not a good forum to have a conversation
Yeah.
at this. So if somebody would just let me know who I should send my analysis to. And then what I'll
Yeah.
also do is I'll also forward the other questions that I have. But let me, I know I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but let me ask a question which I think maybe it would be easier to answer. And that is, suppose, and this is a mind game, suppose everybody in the Commonwealth tonight decided that they were going to purchase 100% renewable energy. And that would generate an incredible amount of revenue for somebody. And the question is who, and where does that energy come from? It's going to come from the same sources that we have today. It's just going to be a reallocation. Where does that money go? And how do we know that where that money goes is into the pockets of somebody who really is going to invest in generating that industry, that energy, and then hopefully expectedly profit from that investment, which we've actually furnished, but we've got no return from. I don't get that.
Yep. So I'll take a first crack, but I think others might want to chime in as well. So I'll say first, we'll go with the hypothetical, but if everybody tried to buy 100% renewable energy tomorrow, there wouldn't be enough of a supply. So that exact thing couldn't happen. But what happens when more people do buy renewable electricity? Well, what happens is that the people who own the RECs, right, have now RECs that are more valuable. And so they're able to sell them for a higher price. So those can be people who own generating plants. They own wind turbines or solar panels, and they haven't sold the RECs yet. They're banking them up ready to sell them the same way you hold anything. You hold a stock and the price goes up, you can sell it for more than you would have otherwise. Or it could be a REC trader who's purchased RECs but hasn't sold them yet, or it could be a generator who's or a supplier rather, who's bought the RECs, who's going to use them otherwise. But whoever owns those RECs is going to see an increase in value, and they're going to profit from that. The reason when that happens, people like me will say, well, that leads to more renewable electricity, is that it tells people who would develop new plants, hey, RECs are worth more now than they used to be. That means I can profit more from my new project than I could before. Now the economics of that investment look better, and so I'm going to build more new ones.
What compels them to do that versus taking that money and investing in some other business?
Well, you would do it, right? So you would do it for the same set of reasons that anybody invests in at any time in any one business over another. Either the financial return looks higher than what they could get elsewhere. It's what they do. So they're in the renewable energy business. They're not in the iPhone business. So it doesn't matter how much you can make building iPhones. I can't make iPhones. I do wind turbines, right? Or it may be, as there are in the case of renewable energy, there are people who have sites where they could build projects, but the economics haven't been good enough to enable them to raise the money for the construction. Price goes up. Now the investment's more attractive to the banks and the others who might finance the project, and the project goes forward. I think on these principles, it's not really so different from the way the rest of the economy works.
Mm-hmm.
You could think about it like rising rents and the impact that has on the construction of new office buildings.
Right. So I'll just finish up and just say, if somebody would just let me know offline how to send my analysis and continue that kind of conversation, I'd be happy to do that.
I'd just like to mention
Yeah.
one thing on that topic. I agree completely with what Paul is saying about when prices go up, somebody is making more money and they can use it for whatever they want. The other thing is that there are short-term and longer-term contracts. And the town, with its community choice, has made some best effort to try to do a contract of the proper term. And so we started, our first contract was a 2-year contract, and we did really well for the townspeople. I think Paul has said that it might be even $1 million lower cost for the town of Lincoln.
Collectively, yeah.
Collectively. Now, a year ago, we had another contract and went shorter. We went to 1 year, and it turns out for the second half of that contract, we are paying more because the price dropped in the middle of the contract. And so Eversource is able to offer a lower price. So I think you want to separate out contract terms and what you decide to do for contracts. And, whether the town has been reasonable and sensible and in its way of looking at contract terms, or whether it hasn't. But I think your 80% is mixing in contract term differences with the rec costs.
Yes, I think that's certainly true. I mean, if it's helpful, I could put up a couple slides about the contract and the price that the town has paid for the program and how it worked over the terms. It would illustrate the points you were just making, I think, is that the first contract, which was for 2 years, the town, that was below the Eversource price noticeably on average over the term of the contract. And so there were significant savings. This current 1-year contract that's wrapping up, in the early part of the contract, the price was below the Eversource price. The latter part of the contract, it's going to be above the Eversource price. Over the course of the year, it's actually just about a break even. So the town just kind of broke even on that. So, save money on the first and we'll break even on the second one.
Break even on the second half of the year coming up.
Break even on the second contract if
Yeah.
For
If you're asking whether it would be useful, I would vote for seeing that chart.
all right. Let me just open it up here. I have to open it up on my screen, I think.
Why are you doing it? Can I ask a follow-up to your answer to Steve Lowe? Although it made sense what you said. It's basically traditional market incentives. Is there also a role for the RPS, the government mandate, in how buying more clean energy, quote unquote, drives more construction?
Correct. So forgive me, I've now lost track of what I'm sharing and what I'm not. So
Sorry, didn't mean to make you multitask.
we've hit the limits of my Zoom expertise, unfortunately. But yes, so the voluntary purchases and the RPS work together. So what they do together is they're increasing the demand for these renewable energy projects. And one way to think about that is actually to add the numbers together. So the RPS this year requires 22% class 1 renewable energy. That's the state requirement. If we took all of the purchases, the voluntary purchases from the community choice aggregation programs, Lincoln, Acton, Lexington, Boston, everybody else, what that does is it effectively adds 2% to the RPS. So it makes it as if the RPS were 24% rather than 22%, which puts us, since the RPS goes up 2% every year, it kind of puts us a year ahead on the RPS schedule because of these voluntary purchases. So the voluntary purchases aren't as big as the RPS, much more, 10% of it about is big right now, but they are adding that much to the RPS requirement. And then I'll see if I can share those other slides.
Ed, have we covered all of your questions?
Oh, I don't think so. But this is the one with the forward markets?
Yeah, so I'm just going to put this
Oh, wow,
background.
okay.
Ed hates this slide, but
this one is a mind bender.
so all this, the important thing to look at here, this just shows the electricity market over the last 8 years or so. And what you can see from this slide is that from 2015 to 2021, prices were really stable. Because of the war in Ukraine, electricity prices went crazy in 2022, and they're down in 23 from where they were in early 22, but they're still quite high and higher than like would have been ever imaginable before this. And that's affected very significantly the Eversource basic service prices, and it also has affected the price that was available to the town for its program. So your first contract I've forgotten the exact date, but was entered into around here in 21 when prices were low, and you locked in that low price, and so you avoided a lot of these giant prices here that showed up in basic service prices. When your next contract entered your next contract, you're more kind of in this middle period where you save money at the beginning, but then will lose money at the end. And this next slide illustrates that. So what this does is it compares the program price to the Eversource basic service price for the standard product, which is the one with the 32% extra renewables. The program price is in blue, the Eversource basic service price is in red. You can see that the Eversource basic service price started going up in January 22 and was higher than the program price all the way through June of 23, and now has dropped down lower. So if we look at the savings for the period, I don't know if my cursor is visible here, but from the program start through February 23, the program was well below basic service, and that's in that period, cumulatively the town saved about 1.2 million. For the period from February 23 through the end of 23, or you're going to just about break even. If we do up the sums, the savings that ran through this first part are pretty much equal to the losses through this, and it doesn't. The way this graph works, it doesn't look like it lines up, but if you do the actual arithmetic, it does. I guess because it's January, if we look at the year, January 23, you see a big savings here. So if we look at calendar 23, you're going to have a break even from this period through this period. And then you had about $1 million in savings from way at the beginning, April 21 through December of 22.
Yeah. So you have that the last 6 months there, you have the new Eversource rate dropping down to what, 16 cents or thereabouts.
Yep.
Yep.
And then just the other thing I'll say is that for a program like this, with all the renewable energy you have in it, getting savings is a pretty remarkable thing. To have a program that's has much more renewable energy than Eversource basic service, but is costing less. That's an awfully good result. Typically, what programs are trying to achieve is save a little on average, maybe, but it's very unusual to have this big amount of savings that you had in the start.
You're doing well and getting paid for it.
Yeah, exactly. Just like those rec holders we were talking about earlier. So they're building these renewable energy projects and then making out like a bandit when all the people started buying renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. Well, capitalism at work. Paul, one of the questions historically, when this all started, we had something called SRECs, because we thought that solar needed something, and it got a preference over wind RECs or other RECs. I gather solar kind of won out, and we don't get that anymore. Is that right? I mean, it disappeared.
Right. Or what happened is that state changed the way it incentivizes solar. So solar does need more of an incentive than wind because it's more expensive to build per kilowatt hour of output. So originally, the way that extra compensation worked was, as you said, so the solar RECs had a higher value, and that's the way the solar projects got more than the wind projects. The state decided in the end that was too complicated, and so they decided to create the SMART program, which is, in my view, even more complicated, but nonetheless, they created the SMART program, which put more of an incentive into the solar up front, but you only get regular old RECs. You don't get SRECs anymore.
Right. And now the SMART program is fully subscribed, pretty much, at least all over the state, or just in this area?
As I understand it, I'm not an expert in this, but I think there's more opportunity in the western part of the state than in eastern.
Yeah. So any other we were gonna go for an hour, right? So we're actually at an hour.
We
I'm
are
curious
now-
what, whoops, I'm curious about what the process is for negotiating contracts and how many different companies are possible to negotiate with.
This is for the Green Energy Choice Program.
Yes,
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are about 5 firms that, or 5 like sort of major firms that supply electricity for these programs. Most of them do it all around the country. This particular year with prices so volatile, actually, those firms have been in and out of the business of getting new business. So when we've done the way the towns make a selection is they run a competitive procurement, they get bids from the various suppliers, and then they decide whether any of the bids are good enough to take and for what term, et cetera. So historically, there are always about 5 bids. Over the last year or so, it's been more commonly 3 or 4, but with a different 3 or 4 as different companies move in and out of the market. It's been interesting to me that even these, very, huge corporations view the market differently at different times, and at some point think they want more business, and other times think they don't want any more.
Are there any
Nancy,
other-
was that enough of an answer?
yes, that's fine.
Okay, yeah. Right, so basically competitive bid process and then the
Okay.
town best price / quality of service. Luckily, we got best of both in one company.
Where is First Choice based?
I believe they're in New Jersey, so they're a smaller firm. They're noticeably smaller than the huge companies that are in this business, but they've been growing steadily over the last year. And as Paul noted, they're remarkable for the level of customer service they provide. So I think Lincoln's very, very fortunate to be working with them. They tend to work with smaller communities, so they wouldn't propose to serve a Worcester or a Boston or something like that, but they work with towns like Lincoln, and then also some slightly larger ones too. Like I think they just signed with Lexington and 1 or 2 others. But
Paul, I
they're,
thought they were in Rhode Island. Is that their local office? North
well,
Kingston?
You could be right, Ed. For some reason, I might be confusing New Jersey and Rhode Island. They're in some state in the New England area, unlike the others who are all in Oklahoma and Texas and places like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Scott?
Thanks, Colette. Thanks, Paul. It has been incredibly helpful to hear this. Is there any great primer you can suggest for understanding more about the actual regional grid concept? And I'm just totally blanking on what's the expression for it? What's the organization?
NEPOOL, ISO New England?
Yeah. And understanding how that all works, because it seems to be when I look online, I get very confused.
That's a very good question. I'm not aware of a single resource that explains it, and it is remarkably complicated.
Yeah, I mean,
Complicated.
it's complicated, but it goes back to how you operate an electric system that has generators and loads and needs to balance the supply and the demand in real time. And you have constraints with not only the finite number of generators, but the capacity of transmission lines. Once you get to distribution, once you get to the poles up and down our streets, those are probably way over capacity generally, so that's not such an issue. But regulating how power is generated and transmitted around New England is a real it's really complicated, and the I want to say it, the management, I think what new ISO New England does is basically instructs all of the generators that are dispatchable, controllable, where to basically set their throttles. And they do this.
That's done every, sort of on an ongoing basis as it's happening.
Oh, yeah, every every few minutes, there's a change in set points. Every day they have an auction for the power for the next day. So that they'll say who wants to provide power. We estimate that we're going to need so much, overall in New England, and they'll put it out to bid each day and for each hour. And then they'll have, in addition to that, so that they'll subscribe to the generators that can control themselves. They can't control the solar, so they have to estimate what that's going to be and look at it like negative load. And wind, same thing. So the residual then has to be programmed and managed from this control center out in central Massachusetts. In addition, if something goes wrong, if a transmission line goes down, for example, then suddenly they have to reconfigure and juggle things to get power from some other location, say into a small area like the Boston metro area. If one of the lines goes down, then they have to bring it in another way. So they have all these contingencies running continuously, as to who could do what if what breaks. And so, yeah, it goes on and on.
And Paul, what's your reaction to the whole concept of peak demand programs with solar and batteries and so forth? If that's, just do commentary on how that helps or challenges the grid and so forth at this point. And if everybody had a battery, what would your reaction be, or as it just proliferates, especially with EVs and heat pumps?
Yeah. So, I think, biggest picture and answering in the most simple way. So batteries are a good thing because they take stress off the grid and enable you to supply more people with fewer generating plants and at lower cost if you had more batteries. So the proliferation of storage is a very good thing.
Thank you.
Yeah. And with fewer and fewer dispatchable plants, as we get rid of the natural gas plants, everything else is, stochastically or randomly generating, then the storage is even more critical, in the long term. Chris or Sue.
Thanks, Ed. And you've just been commenting on sort of spot operations, and going back, Paul, to you introduced the notion of what this looks like from the perspective of our suppliers. How does it work that the supplier locks in a price with us, a contract price over a period of time, and yet within our program, individuals can move around? And the biggest movement perhaps being some event that would cause a lot of people, unfortunately, to drop off. That sounds like that's a risk in their business to be managed, and for which they collect a premium, and sounds like potentially a credit risk that we should keep our eyes on. So we don't have the situation like the banks who thought that deposits would always stay. Am I right? Or I would assume that the movements up and down would be viewed as noise, although we would not want them viewed as noise, because we would want everybody to find their way to 100 who can.
Yes. Right. So that's a really good question. So you're correct that the supplier takes that risk, and what they do when they sign a contract is they project out the load that they would be required to serve for the duration of that contract, and they take into account risks that under the program rules, some customers can leave, some customers can't. You're right that there's a premium for that, and so that the ability that customers have to leave, that customers aren't bound to stay for the duration of the program. There's a cost premium for that because it does put a risk on the supplier. Big customer contracts don't work that way. A big customer signs a contract, they commit for the term, and so that's less of a risk for the supplier. The other thing to add about their business, interestingly, is that the retail suppliers try to eliminate risk as much as possible. So when they contract to serve, let's say Lincoln, for example, for the next 2 years, they're going to project out what they think their load is going to be, and then they're going to buy that electricity that day. So they're not taking the risk that the market price will change, and they'll be, required to cover that obligation with more expensive electricity. They try to reduce or get their risk down as small as possible. Turns out they're not really in the risk-taking business. They're in the electricity supply business. So,
or the middleman business of.
right, yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly what they are. Yeah.
Well, that one graph that you showed, Paul, was a forward market, with all of the different years. I mean, that, to walk through that graph and explain it, to this group would be a great service, because that's the essence of this, first point. When they contract with us, they lock in a supply into the future, so they don't have, that risk of in their lap.
Exactly.
Yeah. Jim Hutchinson.
Yeah, Paul, you said a couple answers ago that storage is great. I totally agree. I'm worried though, if you are asking to get PV installed right now, the installers all discourage you from getting storage, both for residential, which I happen to be doing, and for municipal, which the town happens to be doing. Do you see any change on the horizon in terms of incentives for storage or cost of storage that will help us get more storage onto the grid in New England?
I wish I knew. It's not an area I know much about. So, I mean, I understand the concepts, but I'm not familiar enough with the incentives. And is it the reason they're discouraging the installers are discouraging solar, is that the incentives aren't now sufficient to cover the cost?
Two reasons. For the municipal side, they're happy to install it if you really want to, but it definitely makes the financials worse.
Mm-hmm.
On the residential side, there's a recent hesitation due to the fire suggestions from the fire department to be careful about where you put the batteries and the fire risk of the batteries. So in the sort of interim period while fire departments figure out how exactly they're going to enforce that and what they're going to enforce, the installers are like, maybe you don't want to put storage in right now.
Yep.
Yeah. They want to come in and be out.
Right.
They don't want
slam
the
dunk.
hassle.
Yeah.
Right.
Closure. Scott.
I always agree with Jim Hutchinson, except I disagree slightly here. They haven't just, I'm going through this right this minute, and it's been maddening, as I have 3 Tesla batteries in the current house, and it's a radically different process now going forward with a larger array that's an all-electric house. And it's getting much more complicated because of the all-electric house, because of the fact that it has to be over 400 amps, because of the nature of just that, the draw, or the load, I should say, not so much the draw. And one of the things the companies still don't understand all of the subtleties. The installers don't, some of the manufacturers don't. Enphase was literally in a call the other day with senior folks there. They still don't have a good answer when it gets to storage. So they'd all love to sell us storage. And I'm a huge believer in storage, but it's still not there completely. And one last point about the chemistry. I'm very worried about the lithium ion in like the current house. We're using lithium iron phosphate in the new house, which is much less likely to have a fire problem. But you've got the same problem. The fire department wants it in the garage. The garage is cold unless you heat it. The heated heat takes energy. You can put it in the basement without living space, but the fire code is sort of behind the technologies right now. It seems that lithium iron phosphate is much safer to have even in your basement with less fire problem, but they don't understand it. It's a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I believe Colette, tell me if I'm right. We're planning to go until 8 o'clock, right? Or was it longer?
Yep, we're past due it, and we're just letting the questions roll. And if there aren't any questions, we will wind up.
Well, seeing no other questions, thank you, Paul, for your time to speak with us and inform us and thank you for the good work you've done
Well,
in this
thank you.
area.
It's been a pleasure talking to you tonight and really a pleasure working with the town on your community choice aggregation program. So that's been a ton of fun for me.
Yeah, actually, I have one more question for you. What is the mix that Concord Municipal Light Plant buys? Since you're not regulated.
Well, I'm embarrassed to say, Ed, that since I work on these issues all day for work, I pay almost no attention to what happens in my town, which is, I should not admit in front of this group, but it's true.
The reality is that, electricity, one of our mutual friends, Munir Azam, who was a mobile solar, often asked people, where do they got their electricity? And or kids, where does electricity come from? And they point to a plug on the wall, and it's so easy not to pay attention to where it comes from and all the intricacies of how it's managed and what it does elsewhere that I don't know. It's amazing how many people pay very little attention. So you're not alone. So thank you so much. Colette, can I give it back to you?
And that winds up our Getting to Zero series for this spring. And I thank everybody for attending our presentations. And just remember that they're all posted on our website for any that you'd like to go back and hear again. And there were quite a few awesome ones, including yours, Paul. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take
Have
care.
a nice evening.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye-bye.